Dr. Stacey Shelby, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you so much, David. I'm really excited to be here and talk about the book and meet you.
Yeah, well, that's great. Congratulations on your book. I'm really happy to have you on the show. And in fact, we're going to be discussing your new book, which is titled Tracking the Wild Woman Archetype, a guide to becoming a whole, indivisible woman. And I think at the outset, we should say that even though the subtitle of your book is about becoming a whole, indivisible woman, I hope that doesn't discourage men from listening or purchasing your book. I think many struggle with similar challenges, and also it may help them to better understand the women that they're in relationship with. Would you agree?
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that, David. It means a lot. This is my first book, and I wrote it from the perspective of a woman because I'm a woman. The way I learn is from my lived experience. But the process of individuation and transformation, which is really what the book is about, is universal. Men and women go through it. I wouldn't quite say I have some regrets about having wrote it from that perspective, but that's definitely really highlighted for me now that it's out. I'm an active clinical therapist, and a number of my male clients are reading it, and I know they're finding a lot of value and enjoyment in it as well. So,
hey, well, very good. That's that's a real test of that idea.
That's right.
And what do you mean by the wild woman, by a wild woman, right? That could bring up all sorts of associations.
Yes. Yeah. So there's an important differentiation here that I really tried to make through the book, and very often they would conflate as well, just because they are so interrelated. The wild woman, or a wild woman, is a human woman who has re-engaged with the wild natural self or soul that belongs to her. So she's done enough personal work and self-reflection, differentiation from culture, owning her shadow, enough of that work that she is conscious of her own soul and her own instinctual nature and her own spiritual nature. So that's a woman who has engaged with the wild woman archetype.
Okay, so it's different than the association that a lot of people might have, which would be a woman who's partying all the time.
Absolutely.
And so on. And what you describe is quite different from that. Really, you're talking about an authentic woman, a woman who's deeply authentic.
Deeply authentic, natural. What is her most pure form of herself, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe it does include being out partying and having fun. That, that can be the case. But, that pejorative sense of the wild woman being out on the dance floor in her high heels and miniskirts, which is a valid expression, but it's only one expression of the, many, many expressions.
Okay, and you referred to the wild woman archetype. So what does that add to it?
So that is what we have to differentiate here. So the wild woman archetype, so I'll just maybe define archetype the way I'm using it, because these words are big words we're throwing around. I'm using it in the sense that it is a predetermined or original energy force or field that is pre-existent, and it's very stable. It is what it is. So to make an example, an acorn will always produce an oak. The wild woman archetype, or if we're talking about men, the wild man archetype, will always produce the wild woman, right? Or it will produce an authentic woman. It's always available. We just have to be, I think, older before we can engage with it, about midlife.
Mm-hmm. And part of what it connotes to me is a kind of timeless pattern that's always been around and accessible to tap into either willingly, or sometimes one might be seized by it.
Yes, I would say more often seized by it. I don't know that we willingly go to the path of individuation, because it's usually some sort of crisis or event that causes us, not even crisis, childbirth, which is a beautiful experience. It's just such a big change that can be a catalyst for engagement with that wild woman archetype. I also think it's important, because I like to give credit where credit's due, that Clarissa Pinkola Estes originally named and brought out of shadow the wild woman archetype, and that was in 92, I think it was. And she wrote about that in her book, Women Who Run with the Wolves. And that was a huge inspiration for me. I was about 20 at that point. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. By the way, I'm just realizing maybe it would be nice to show your book on camera here so that people get a sense of what it looks like. It's a nice, high quality paperback volume, something like that. Okay.
Thank you.
And so what are the challenges that get in the way of becoming a wild woman?
I think our biggest challenge is going to be ourselves. I think the hardest lesson we learn is how to get out of our own way,
How do we get in our own way?
By wanting, let's say, the ego. So I'm going to define ego as the totality of what is conscious to the person. So it's the conscious personality. It's a very Jungian way of defining it. It's very different than a Buddhist or yoga way of defining it, which is maybe more about relinquishing desires or those kinds of things. So the ego, the personal ego, likes to hold on to certainty. It likes to create safety. It's very well-intending, right? But it likes to protect us. And so that brings up all sorts of things like lethargy, like fear, like resistance, like self-sabotaging, all these kinds of things that prevent us from showing up for connecting with our soulful self, right?
Yeah. I'm remembering that one of the tools that you use a lot in writing this book and exploring the various topics is your own dream life. And so I really want to encourage you to, if there are points here where it would make sense to share one of your dreams, that will certainly enliven it for us all, I'm sure.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
I'll hold that as a thought. There's none there's about 20 popping into my head right now. So we'll see which one wants to come out.
Okay. And so let's talk some more about the challenges that get in the way of becoming a wild woman. For example, I believe there are historical ones and cultural ones and maybe others.
Yeah. So, wow, there's a lot. So historical and cultural, I don't know that those are separate as challenges for individuals authenticating, men and women. I think one of the really hard things to do as we differentiate ourselves is to even become aware that we're in a patriarchal culture. And so patriarchy being defined as a culture where society gives dominion to males. We see that in the workplace, in the home environment, in academia, all different, in our moral code and values, certainly in the religious structures. So that's swung quite far to balance, and I would define that as patriarchy. So I'm not saying men are in that as well. We're all in it. We have to become conscious that we're in it, that is the paradigm that we're in. And then when we become conscious of that, we have options, we have choices, we can make different decisions, we can show up in a way that feels authentic for ourselves. So much of the work is trying to recognize the water that we're swimming in, the culture that influences us. There's a lovely story that I'll tell briefly about two young fish swimming in the ocean. And the older fish says, "How's the water today, boys?" And the boys are, "What's water?" They don't know because they are in it all the time.
Right.
That's what being in culture is like.
Yeah. I think there's a particular awareness right now, or focus. I watched the the Oscars last night, and a lot of it was devoted to the Me Too movement and those issues of the abuse, male abuse primarily, sexual and power abuse, I would say. So this is an interesting moment in time.
It's a
Maybe
very,
a unique moment in Western culture.
yeah. I think so I'm Canadian, first of all, which I think is worth mentioning, because even though we're very similar to the US, we're sitting quite comfortably with a very liberal government right now, which is obviously quite different than what's happening down here. I wrote this book, I started probably 10 years ago with my first papers and thoughts, because this was what was happening for me. I think it's been building in the collective, probably, I'm going to say maybe since about the 50s or even earlier, where the feminine, the archetypal feminine, was starting to really swing the pendulum away from patriarchy and much more towards a more balanced swing. So all of this massive disruption that's happening in society, that's really highlighting, misogyny and abuse of women and abuse of power, is about the abuse of the feminine. Not only the literal women, but also the feminine archetype within all of our psyches. We all have it. And so as that counterbalance is coming, it's coming with a bit of an explosion. It's like a volcano that's erupting, where this energy is wanting to recorrect itself and not be so far one-sided. But there's backlash to that as well, too, right?
It's interesting because it goes back so far, and you mentioned that you've been influenced a lot by the Jungian perspective, and certainly this is one of the things that Jung was highlighting in his work.
Absolutely, and he was 100 years ago. Yeah.
So,
it's been building. The Kairos, the time, has been building for quite a while.
Okay.
In the scheme of how many years we have had a Western culture, that's over 2000. Even if it's 100 years, it's still pretty short, right?
Yeah. We use the word patriarchy as if we all understand what it means, but you do spell it out a bit in the book, and maybe you could do that here.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said a bit earlier, I want to be careful, because it's not about individual men. It is about the cultural water that we all exist in, men and women, right?
Kind of the structure of society.
The structure. It's absolutely the structure.
Yeah.
And it shows up in, the ways that males do have dominion and power still in most arenas. Often that is abused. We've been striving for equality, women striving for equality with equal pay and equal care in the home and these different kinds of things. But that's not actually equalizing the feminine, right? The feminine, those are still patriarchal values. To be even pursuing pay and goals and climbing the corporate ladder, finishing, which is ironic, I'm going to say this, but finishing doctorate degrees or whatever we do, right? These are all still very much within the patriarchal paradigm. It's very linear, it's very goal driven, it's very consciousness focused.
Okay. You know what? Your voice, and I think it's probably the technology, but it's soft at times.
Oh, let me see if I can lean a bit closer.
I think that would probably help. Yeah.
Okay. Is that a bit better?
Yeah. And so you're mentioning masculine and feminine. And again, maybe you should clarify a little bit about what's meant by those terms, because they're stereotypical ideas around that I think what you're getting at is a little different than the stereotypes.
Yes, it is. And interestingly, I personally wanted to be with kind of non-duality, because a feminine expression to me is non-duality. Masculine and feminine are still in a duality type position, and yet we need a metaphor to talk about, to anchor this conversation in, right? And so I used it in the book as well. So in a really like overly simplistic term, qualities I would associate with the feminine archetype are things like ambiguity, lunar consciousness, confusion even can be part of that. Certainly softness, femininity, I would say beauty lies on that side. A more soulful, heart-centered way of being would largely be on that side. Where archetypal masculine qualities, I would say, are more about linear, clarity, goal-driven, ambition, more of a like a hardness to it. So I'm trying to show different opposites there, because masculine and feminine are opposites. So what ideally I think we want is a balance in those, or a unification of those, which would be the conjunctiano, the marriage of the two, right? Which would be symbolized in something else.
Is it the case that some women unconsciously support the patriarchy?
Most, certainly all of us probably do, until we become conscious of it. And then when we become conscious of it, even then, our fear, because it wants certainty and control, can choose to, or maybe not even consciously choose, but can do things that will keep us kind of subversive, or not subversive, submissive to that. Mm-hmm. Even though maybe we want to be subversive to that, we may not be successfully, right?
I think sometimes vocal women who are feminists are characterized as being angry at men. I don't get that impression reading your book or speaking with you, but are you angry at men?
No, I love men. And honestly, I think most women I'm writing for do. We love men, or women as lovers, but no, not angry. But angry about the inequality, right? Which is not male or man specific. Yeah.
Okay.
And I've been using this word lately because I actually at one point realized I was probably a feminist, and I went, oh my God, I hate that word because it implies being angry at men, and I really am not. And so I've come up with this because I think I am probably a feminist. I really want to advocate for a feminine type of feminist. So being a feminine feminist.
Sure.
Opposed to being a feminist that is angry and striving for equality within a male purview or patriarchal purview of the world.
Yeah, yeah. And as I recall, you talk a bit about your growing up, the world that you grew up in, your family of origin. And so you weren't kind of born a wild woman. This is something that's kind of developed as you've developed. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the background that you came out of.
Yeah, I don't know. First of all, I don't know that any of us are born wild women. I think that's something that develops at the individuation phase of life, which is more like midlife onward. So to be born a wild woman, I think, is just simply not possible. That's my belief about the process. Now, my particular life, I was born in 1970, and by then the women's movement was well underway. And, I was fortunate to have Christine Downing on my dissertation chair, who's well into her 80s now, and was, definitely in that women's movement at that stage, and was like, we were out there working hard, and they were, and they still are. But that was not my experience growing up. I was, coming from a lineage of both my grandmothers and my mother and my aunts. We're still very, very much in that patriarchal dominance, right? So you you know, you grow up and you meet a nice man and you have 2 kids, you have a dog, you get a nice white picket fence, and then you're there. You've completed your whole raison d'etre, or your purpose, right? So I grew up with that as my thinking that's what I was supposed to do. And then, of course, I did that because I'm creative, as are many women. And then I was deeply disappointed that I wasn't feeling satisfied with life at all. In fact, it got quite depressive. It was really awful. It's like, this can't be it. And then things kind of fall apart, as they do for most of us at that age in life. I was in my 30s.
Now, were you married? I seem to
Yeah.
recall that you
Yeah,
were.
I totally did the white picket fence dream. Yeah.
And you're a mother as well, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So my father, yeah, so that's an important part that happens for a number of us women. With the father-daughter relationship, there can be an unconscious experience where the father projects his ideal soul image, or his anima, we call that in Jungian terms, onto his daughter. And it's not because he doesn't love his daughter, it's just because that's his idealized image of his soul. And the daughter very often carries that, with the innocence and the sweetness and the beauty and the love that the father feels toward the daughter. But what happens in that problem, you know, and the girl experiences it as being like the daddy's little girl, and, you know, feels enamored with her dad, and there's lots of love and joy. But what happens is the woman, or the little girl, doesn't learn how to be seen for herself. She doesn't learn how to have her own voice, her own values. She learns to be the soul image of her father. And that then is how she's taught to relate to men going forward. So in romantic love, that shows up as absolutely disastrous, because she has no voice. She doesn't know who she is, what she stands for, what her values are. And this was certainly my experience as well.
How do you feel about women who opt for a fairly traditional marriage, you know, for traditional lifestyle, including marriage and child rearing and so on?
Yeah, it totally depends on how and why they're doing it. I mean, I hope to have a relatively traditional paradigm as well, where it's, you know, one monogamous relationship and family. I value family probably more than anything. But if a woman is staying in a relationship that is not nourishing her soul, because she's afraid to leave for various reasons, because of anything that's, usually it is fear, but anything that's kind of violating her personal growth and process, then I want to see them either learn how to grow within that relationship, or learn how to grow separately, right? It's still a great model of relationship if it's held consciously, if the dynamic can be worked with. And as long as the woman herself is not being minimized, right?
Yeah,
Lost,
yeah,
lost in it.
yeah. Now, this might seem like a digression, but you identify with bears quite a bit, maybe as a kind of totem animal. Maybe you could tell us a bit about that.
I do love bears. It's almost a hard thing to even explain. So first of all, I live in a town where there are a lot of bears. I live in a very small town.
In Canada, so I guess there were probably lots of bears in Canada.
Yeah, yeah, there are. And when I was doing this research and the bear was so prevalent, it was, you know, I was seeing them 3 times a day. Like, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Like, to be encountering bears out, you know, outside my house. And it transformed from a place of, and they were so, like, in my dreams every night. And it transformed from a place of, like, really afraid to respectful engagement. So maybe I will share a bear dream at this point, and then we'll talk about the symbol of bear. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I was just
Yeah.
remembering that you had bear dreams. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of them, well into the research stage, and the individuation process was, I'm at this farmhouse. It's my farmhouse. The door is just like a swinging screen door. It's not much of a door. And I'm outside and I'm tending to the horses and chickens and baby ducks. And I'm worried that the baby ducks are going to get stomped on. But then there's this knowing that this is all how we learn how to relate with each other. Little tiny things that are vulnerable and big, huge things that can't even see the little tiny things. We learn. And then off in the field, I see the mama bear and her cubs, and she's always there, and I know her and she knows me, and we're just always aware of each other, which was really part of my lived experience at that point. And then she's coming towards me, which in my dream life, that was not something that was usually happening. And she's coming towards me quickly. And so I go inside my not much of a door, and I try to hide in this little square box, and the square box is far too small for me. I don't fit, but I squish myself in there as best as I can. And then the bear comes into where I am, and I see her, and I see her stand up and transform into a woman. The bear shapeshifted into a woman, and I'm looking at her, and I come out of my box a little more because it feels kind of safer because now she's not a bear, and I recognize her. And then it dawns on me that the bear is me and I am the bear.
Yeah. Yeah. What a great dream, you know, the juxtaposition of you being squeezed into a little box where there's not enough room,
Yeah.
into becoming this big, this big mama bear.
Yes.
And that really kind of mirrors your process.
It really mirrors the process. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Really does. And the bear as a symbol, you know, as you just mentioned, represents mama bear. So I have a son. And, you know, a lot of becoming a conscious mother has been really wrapped up in this whole process for me, you know, how to be an instinctual mother and protect my little cub and take care of him and do all these mother things. So there's a lot about that protection and motherhood at a personal level for me that was going on. And then as a bigger symbol, which I didn't know at the time, but I came across it when I was working in eco-psychology, the symbol of the bear is the symbol of the wild feminine. It's very, it's about femininity, and it's about the instinctual wild feminine. Instinctual because it's an animal, right? And we're animals close to our instinctual life. So it's an aspect or a symbol that can represent the wild feminine, or in my case, the wild woman, right? Which was exactly what happened in that dream.
What does sexuality look like for the wild woman? It's
Yeah.
just the phrase sort of brings that to mind, right? And so what sorts of issues come up for the
Yeah.
wild woman?
Yeah. So to start back to where we talked about, it's not a promiscuous woman necessarily, right? So that is kind of the, you know, maybe the stereotype of how that's understood when we first say wild woman. You know, we might be implying that she's a bit promiscuous or something. Maybe she is promiscuous if she wants to be, if she chooses to be, and if that's happening from an empowered place, that can be an expression of the wild woman. But the point being, a woman who's engaged with the wild woman archetype, who's really authenticated and differentiated a lot, is maybe no longer accepting the mainstream model of relationship, the nuclear family, or even the dyad of two, right? So we see relationships that may be open. We see women having relationships with women when perhaps before they maybe preferred men. We see women choosing no relationship, like choosing to be single. And then we see women consciously preferring the model of monogamy, and that is their choice. That's aligned with their personal values. It's not because those values were imposed on them from birth, right? So The sexuality can be whatever feels right for the woman in that moment. It might change tomorrow. It's a real moment by moment consciousness, an empowered way of choosing and expressing.
Okay, another thing that you talk about is sacred experience and suffering. Maybe you can take us through that.
Sacred experience and suffering. Yes. So suffering is one of the catalysts that can really cause us to wake up, to have a spiritual awakening, to go for through the individuation process, to go through the alchemical transformation. The more we lean into the suffering and explore what's causing the suffering, the more we can learn about ourselves. Very often there's complexes at work. So maybe, a common suffering is people will feel abandoned or overwhelmed, either side, in romantic relationship, and that can cause suffering. But it can be anything, right? That's just a relationship model. There can be some sort of crisis that causes the person to have to really sit with themselves and look at all that they have to, and to go into these emotions of jealousy, neediness, all these kind of yucky things that we don't like about ourselves, but we all have, and really exploring those. So if we approach that from a sacred perspective, which depth psychology really leans into, then we can start to find meaning in the suffering. And it's not that we don't suffer. There's no spiritual bypassing. That doesn't happen. It doesn't work. And it's very popular these days to spiritual bypass. And by that, I mean trying to avoid it. We can't do that. But we can find meaning. We can really try to find what is meaningful in this. What am I learning? What's the value? What's the growth? And we can move into that a lot more. And that can completely change our perspective.
Yeah, when I think about the sacred part, I think for me, the way that I would experience that is seeing myself in the great chain of being, if you will, seeing it in a larger context, and realizing that my experience may not be utterly unique, but is in fact part of an age-old pattern.
Yeah.
And you can either despair about that insight, or you can really take it in and own it and feel like, wow, there's some kind of a larger drama that I'm involved in, that's playing through me.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's playing.
And you talk about alchemy quite a bit in the book as well. And there's not going to be time for you to go through the whole thing, saying everything you've learned about alchemy. But I was interested, you talk about love as the alchemical vessel. And I think that would fit very well in what we're talking about right now.
Yes. So that's going back to where, if we're talking about a more traditional paradigm where it's some sort of dyad, and that can be same sex or heterosexual, it really doesn't matter. When there's challenges, like you can be sure in a romantic relationship, we're going to have a lot of friction, right? And it's the friction that gives us the opportunity to work through our complexes, right? And have this, I initially had this belief that, okay, I'll go do my personal, and a lot of us do, I'm not the only one, that have this belief, I'll go do my personal work and then I'll be all ready and I can ready for my next relationship and it'll be easy. And that doesn't happen either.
This is so disappointing to hear.
Damn it, I thought I had it. But no, the relationship itself can be the container that causes the transformation. The friction can be the container that shows us the tensions and the things we need to work through. So staying in it and staying with it might be the answer in some relationships. maybe they can, women in particular, but also no, it's different what they need to speak for. Learning to speak up for themselves within the context of a relationship is a very common problem. Women need to just speak up for who they are and what they want and what their values are. Men, I'm witnessing learning, speaking up for their emotions and not being ashamed of that. Really, like, I feel really sad today that whatever is happening, you know, and particularly the millennials, there's just some amazing men coming up through the millennial generation that are really wanting to learn how to speak up about things that has not been typically masculine in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. It's part of that cultural transformation that I think we see happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Very
Yeah.
much.
And it's part of what people on the political right really find repellent
Yeah.
in men.
Yeah.
They don't regard them as real men. Real men are going to be, you know,
Yeah. And
feisty and
that's the
not too
backlash.
much into their emotions.
Yeah. That's the backlash for sure. I had an
Yeah.
interesting exploration with a man, a younger man, about this. He's in his 20s, and we were like, why is it so shameful? And I think it probably does have something to do with the warrior archetype, that for men to be in the warrior archetype, the Aries archetype, they have to go do things that don't allow for empathy. And I think that can be really hard. But we're not so much there anymore. You know, we're
Yeah, I grew up in that period. I can really relate to that. I grew up, well, I was born in 1940, so I was small during the war years, but definitely as we, would see newsreels and things. And so I had a very conscious sense that I had to harden myself if, in fact, I was ever going to have to go through that,
yeah,
which was a horrible terrifying experience to contemplate and to try to get ready, to, and thankfully I never did have to do that. I'm very grateful.
yeah, yeah.
I'm not sure how, well, yeah.
Yeah, but it is, I think it's important to just contemplate where that hardening of men's emotions perhaps originated from, right? And it, of course, is a protection mechanism.
Yeah.
There was really good reason for it.
Yeah. War has always been with us, unfortunately, as far as we know.
Yeah,
And it's fallen to men for that to be part of that is to to protect their family and children, and then that extends out to the tribe and so on.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you also talk about personification and projection. um, how do those play out in this particular arena that we're talking about?
Yes, and personifying. These are kind of leaning into James Hillman, quite a lot here, um, with his differentiation between personifying and personification. Personifying, and it's a shame these all start with P and are such similar words because they're different. Personifying is about seeing the world ensouled. So we want to do that. We want to see the world ensouled. We want to see it imaginally. We want to have connection with the objects, the buildings, the nature, the beauty that is all around us. And that's part of seeing through personifying. Now, that used to be a lot more inherent. I think we did that more naturally in older or more traditional, like indigenous type cultures. Now we've moved away from that, though, and even the alchemists, which are 200, 150 years ago, were that whole thing was about personifying. They would project onto the material that they were transforming aspects of their psyche. It's a very soulful thing. It's not. So they put into their little beakers and vases whatever the elixir is that they're trying to mix together.
Yeah.
It's a projection externally, right?
Yeah, what you're saying about it used to be easier, you're talking about when we live so much closer to nature, right?
Yes. And
And
we
you're
didn't
living
put
in nature, it's kind of natural to personify the sun as some kind of a god force, or
yeah.
the magnificent trees around you and the animals and so on.
Yes. And then I think we lose some of that connection and we start to put that onto individual human beings. Now, the problem with that is the same problem with the father-daughter relationship. We're not seeing the person, the actual human being, what they like, what they stand for, what their values are. We're not seeing that person. We're seeing the image that we want to see of that person. You know, that's the whole rose-colored glasses falling in love stage. And then when we stop projecting our idealized vision onto the other person, then we go through that whole messy process of, you know, disentangling that illusion. And that's terrible. That's when we start to run into the, oh, you're not who I thought you were. Well,
Yeah, right.
right. So projection is a problem because it gets in the way of seeing the person. And yet I don't think there's a way to fall in love without projection. So we have an interesting paradox with that particular romantic projection,
Mm-hmm.
where personifying is a way of ensouling the world. We name our stuffies when we're children, right? Or, you know, all these different things, we name them. We see personality and characteristic in our objects. And that's a way of personifying and seeing the God or the beauty in the thing.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. And you have a nice discussion of play and paradox, and I think that's in the context of thinking about femininity, that
Yeah,
the wild woman would have access to a kind of playful aspect, and to appreciate, to hold the opposites, and to appreciate paradox instead of certainty.
yes. So those are all feminine qualities, paradox, both, and these kinds of things, play, uncertainty. So play, I would suggest, belongs closer to the wild woman, which is to use the archetype of the puella, the eternal girl, where puer is the eternal boy. We don't hear so much about the eternal girl, who is the puella. But that really belongs to the spontaneity, the playfulness, the mischievousness. It is the quality that will upturn the apple cart, but for the higher good. It's almost kind of mercurial in a way, but it is about that youthful female spirit, right? The creative imagination.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You speak about sacred sexuality. Maybe you could say something about that.
Yes. Yeah, when I started with that, I started looking really kind of more Eastern traditions into Tantra and these kinds of things. And that just kind of didn't resonate. A wild woman is an embodied woman. So, like I said about suffering, we can't spiritual bypass. We have to stay in our bodies, we have to stay with what's happening. Sacred sexuality, my conclusion on it is that any kind of sexuality where the woman is staying in her body, and the man too, or women, or whoever's there, whoever's in the room for the party, it's really embodied. It's really staying with it. Maybe it is mundane. You know, sometimes sex is not great sex. It's just sex, but it's what it is. Sometimes it's really great. Or transcendent. We're not trying to transcend anything. We're trying to stay in the body. So anytime we're staying in the human experience, we're staying in the human body, to me, that's sacred. To take that further, beyond sexuality, just living and staying here in this earth with our emotions, with our bodies, those that tell us so much information, that's sacred. So the work of just being here, like really here and home with ourselves, to me is the most sacred act that we can offer.
Yeah, yeah. And you also underscore that perfection is not the goal so much as wholeness.
Yes. Yeah, I think I was, as a younger woman, very much under the illusion that we were striving to be perfect. Of course, that didn't work out, so I had to reevaluate that one. And I've since concluded that we are perfect with our imperfections, right? And that is actually closer to wholeness. Accepting our imperfections is really important, knowing that we're not going to be like, humans are fallible, we're vulnerable, we're mortal. That accepting all of that and all of our moods and our emotions and even the ones we don't like, accepting that's, and looking at it. Yeah, sometimes we feel needy or jealous or yucky or greedy or whatever. Looking at all that stuff, where wholeness is, so perfection, I'll say, is, trying to be flawless, right? And that is just unachievable. And
at the beginning of our conversation, you referred to this as your first book, which implies that you may have something else in the back of your mind and maybe another book.
Yeah.
Is it just that you're just open to that possibility, or do you actually
I
have
think it's
something
there.
that you're
It's I
thinking
can feel
about?
it cooking already. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it cooks. I think it'll be gender neutral next time, though. I'll really try to work more towards that unification of masculine and feminine, and try to find different metaphors that are not gender explicit, because it mixes up men and women too much. But I couldn't find that for this book. I wasn't there yet, so hopefully
Yeah.
I'll be there for the next one.
Yeah. Now you live in British Columbia, right?
Yeah.
And now you're in New York City for an event. We were talking about this a little bit, and listeners, viewers might be interested in this, that this book seems to have led to some kind of an opportunity in the world. So tell us why you're in New York.
Because I'm lucky.
Yeah.
What happened? It was funny. It was Valentine's Day. So Eros and Psyche they're dear to my heart. It's my favorite myth, and it was really my process. And so Valentine's Day, I really like Valentine's Day, even though I don't have, romantic chocolates going back and forth or whatever. It was a really special day. I got this call out of the blue at about 8:30 in the morning from an agency in New York, and they were asking if I would come and speak at a event on women's empowerment, and in particular female charisma, for a fashion designer named Carolina Herrera, who does just beautiful work. She's devoted her life to beauty and celebrating feminine beauty, and just the values are very aligned with what's in the book. So they're launching a fragrance called Good Girl, and the tagline is "It's good to be bad," right? So really
Oh,
in that
yeah.
Puella archetype of, like, let's upset the apple cart a little bit here, because we have to own our femininity. So it's just super aligned with the work that I've been researching. So they phoned and said, "We want you to come speak." And so it all happened very fast. And now here I am in New York, and we're doing it on Wednesday.
Yeah, it sounds like a really magical development, and who knows where it will lead. Somebody in the audience, it may spark something that, oh, come speak to our group, or
Yeah, well, the audience is only international media. So it's safe to say it'll spark something that'll
uh-huh.
do something. Who knows what?
Well, well, I wish you many sparks along the journey.
Thank you. It does seem quite fortuitous timing that the book comes out at a time when it seems really relevant culturally. Because
Yeah,
I couldn't have planned that. It was just
yeah,
I think it's been building in the collective unconscious for quite some time, and my book just happens to come out at the time that it's really hitting a peak.
yeah. Well, that might be a good place for us to wrap it up. That's a good statement of where we are right now. So, Stacey, I really want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
David, thank you so much for having me. It's been just really fun to chat with you, and a real pleasure.